Thank you, Gerald. Thank you. It's my privilege to be here this afternoon. I want to thank the American Catholic Historical Association, Laura and her staff, and all the people here at Villanova for bringing me here and having this opportunity to share a little of my new story. As Gerald said, I come from the Midwest via Pennsylvania, and I want to tell you a little bit of that story. When my great-grandparents came with 4 sons, they settled in Pittsburgh. For some reason, they ended up in Pittsburgh. 2 of the brothers found jobs in Pittsburgh, and 2 of them did not, so they had to move on further west, and that's how they ended up in Chicago. One of those 2 was my grandfather. Years later, my sister married a nice German guy, and he was transferred here to Philadelphia, so our branch is now in Chicago and Philadelphia because all her kids were raised here in Philadelphia, and one of them is an alumnus and sitting right back there of Villanova University. So we have a lot of connections between here and Chicago. I want to tell you a little bit about the prequel to Pure and Tarnished Hearts, called Journey of 3 Pure Hearts, because it gives you just a little background of who the characters are. But I want you to feel comfortable to know that if you read Pure and Tarnished Hearts, you'll get enough background that you don't feel like you've been cheated, because most of this story takes place in Ireland. Okay. I began writing after I retired from teaching. I was a teacher of history. I was a middle school principal. I was a Catholic school principal for 37 years. And when I retired, I decided I wanted to leave a legacy for my grandchildren, and that's kind of what urged me on to write some stories. And I started with a children's book, and after I did that, I enjoyed it so much, I said, I better put some of my history stuff together and maybe I can come up with a decent story. And so I got interested in the Celtic area when we started to travel to Ireland. And the Irish people were just so welcoming and so friendly. And our first trip there happened just a couple of weeks after 9/11. So you can well imagine how nervous we were. In fact, we weren't going to go on the trip at all. But the president said, don't cancel your trips. You know, he's telling the American people, be calm, show your courage, you know, go out there, and they're not going to scare Americans and all this kind of stuff. And so he said, okay, we'll go on the trip. So we made out our wills, gave it to our kids, and we went on the trip. All right. And the people were just most gracious and sympathetic and understanding and helpful to make us enjoy the trip. Well, the Irish people, of course, we were there. We have some Irish background and some Italian background and some German background, and we're kind of a mixed family. When we got there, the first thing we wanted to see, of course, were the leprechauns, right? Because everybody knows about the leprechauns when they go to Ireland. The Irish people are telling us, we're more than leprechauns, Mr. Cole. You know, there's a lot more to the Celtic history. And I said, I know, but everybody over by me wants to hear about the leprechauns. So I did write a leprechaun book. So it's just a cute fantasy tale, and I did it because I wanted my kids to, and my grandkids to have a little kick out of history. But I managed to weave in the story of St. Patrick into the legends and so forth, so they got a little bit of their faith history as well. In my new story, you're going to be introduced to 4 characters. Those 4 characters are born in Ireland, the west coast of Ireland, and they are living in a time which is probably one of the most darkest periods of Irish history, and also during a time of tumultuous political activity over here on the other side of the pond, which was very anti-immigrant at the time, though the people who were coming here had no idea that there was this animosity to immigrants and to Catholic immigrants in particular. The year 1829 is an important date in Irish history. It is the Act of Emancipation, prior to this time, the Irish people were not allowed to practice their faith. They were not allowed to own land more than 1 acre in size. They were not allowed to live within 5 miles of a city. And they were not allowed to own a home that was worth more than £5. In 1829, the penal laws were canceled. It's called the Act of Emancipation, very similar to Lincoln's emancipation several years later here in the States. Only this time, the Irish people were allowed to own land. They were allowed to sit in Parliament. They were allowed to practice their faith. But by the time that really got into gear, and by the time the people began to feel this freedom, the blight hit. And that kind of just put everything back. The people were devastated. And that's the time period in which my story begins. This is Cromwell's Fortress. Oliver Cromwell is a villain in almost all my stories because he is the sole leader of this period of the 17th century, which destroyed almost anything you want to see that has Catholic roots in Ireland. And he was a very, it was because of him the penal laws were passed. It was because of him that he said the Irish people should either go to hell or live in Connacht, which is a very bleak western region of mountains in Western Ireland. So he was a natural target for me to make him the villain in my stories. And it wasn't hard to make him a villain. This fortress he built in order to imprison priests. The priests were captured if they were ministering the faith, and they were put here, and they were either going to be exiled to Australia or North America. And this, until 1829 emancipation, was the fate of the Catholic clergy in Ireland. Here on this island now, in the 1840s, when the potato blight really began to hit, 3 counties in particular were most severely hit in that time period: County Mayo, County Galway, and County Clare. So I decided I would choose my characters from each of those counties. And then this is the island of Inishbofin. Now, when I visited Inishbofin, I found it to be a virtually barren rock pile. I couldn't imagine how people could still live there, and they still have a couple of hundred residents that live here. I don't know how they make a living. Sure, they have some sheep, and they could graze in there and so forth, but I saw this one guy kneeling down outside his cottage, digging out the rocks and trying to plant something, and I went up to him and I said, "Holy cow, how do you make anything grow here?" And he said, "With great difficulty, but it does grow." Okay, all right. And I walked around the mountains there and went into the fortress area, and on my way I passed a cow. And just roaming down the path all by itself, no one leading it. And I thought, well, isn't this strange? You know, they have this cow, and I feel like I'm in India or someplace, you know, is this special? And yes, the cow is special. Inishbofin means Island of the White Cow, and in legend, the white cow is a forerunner of kind of like a warner that bad things were going to happen. So you're going to hear a little bit about that legend in my story as well. On Inishbofin, my character is named James Shields. He's a young kid. His parents, Kathleen and James, are struggling. They live in a little cottage, which is very typical of the era, and they are pretty much destitute. They yearn to have their son have a better opportunity. James would play on the ruins of the Cromwell Fortress, and this is how you are introduced to him in my story. I chose young people to be 3 of the main characters because when you're writing about the famine, it could be really dark and it's really sad and it's very heavy. And I didn't want the story, I wanted families to be able to read the story and feel hope and feel joy and feel their faith come alive as well. So I decided that who better to do that than the type of kid that I taught for 35 years. You know, they're full of hope, they're full of the Dickens, you know, the mischief and so forth. This Even though this is the 19th century, I didn't think 19th century teens were that different than 21st century teens, except maybe that more was expected of a 19th century teen than perhaps we expect of our teens today. And so James was playing up there on the fortress in Inishbofin, which is in the western coast, off the western coast of County Mayo. He's a frail lad, and yet he's full of the Dickens, pure of heart, pure, deep faith, and his mother decides the only way to save him is to offer him to the priesthood. Now, you know, it was very common for the people in Europe and in America, Catholic people in America, to have a number of children, and one of them was always dedicated to the priesthood and one was dedicated to the sisterhood, right, to be a nun. This is a very common practice. Now, in my family, that was not well received, that practice, because I'm the only son, and in an Italian family, the only son does not become a priest. So when I announced I wanted to be a priest, my father went epileptic and said, no, you're the only son. And in those days, of course, the name was very important. Today, it doesn't make any difference. You know, my daughters go on with their life, and they're a cola just as much as anyone else. So I did go to the seminary, and anyway, and they used to visit me every weekend, because in those days, you weren't allowed visitors, except on the weekend. And in those days, of course, everything was in Latin and so forth. And they would come on Sunday and they would take me out, and they would take all my buddies out with us, because that's the only time we would eat, because we didn't like the food in the seminary. And they would always say, well, you're ready to come home, you know. So one day I said, yes, I'm ready to come home. And my wife wants me to say this little story because she wants you to know she did not steal me from the seminary. All right. So here we have James Shields up on that fortress. And he plays pirate. And the reason he plays pirate is because in that harbor, and if you go to Inishbofin to this day, you're going to see a mast out of the harbor water, right in the middle of the harbor. It's 200 years old. Legend says that it is the mast of a pirate ship. And the most famous pirate of Ireland, and possibly all of Europe in this era of history, which would have been during the time of Cromwell and just before Cromwell, was Gracie O'Malley, the pirate queen. And she would roam these waters, and no matter if you were Spanish ship or Irish ship, and certainly if you were an English ship, you had no hope. She was going to get you, and she was going to take your stuff, and she was going to give it to the people of Western Ireland. She was kind of Robin Hood type of pirate, because Western Ireland, even in her day, was very destitute, very poor, and it was a great struggle to survive. When she was captured, the story goes that she was brought before Queen Elizabeth I, face to face, queen to queen. She didn't back down, and the Queen Elizabeth I asked her, tell me the truth about what's happening in Western Ireland. Why are people so unhappy and so against us? And then the Queen paused, waiting for O'Malley to respond, and then she added, and don't give me any of your blarney, tell me the truth. So it was Elizabeth I who gave us the term blarney, which is now part of the language of not only Irish people, but a lot of people when you're talking about tall stories and exaggerating a bit. And James, my character, is fascinated with that history. Down the west coast of Ireland, there are three islands called the Aran Islands, and Inishmore is the largest of these islands. And from there, I decided I would take the second character, because in visiting that island, I felt that it did represent what was going on during the famine era, even to a recent time. This island did not receive electricity to the late 1950s. So if you want to talk about struggling and so forth, the people of these islands literally dug out sand and seaweed from the ocean in order to pack them between the rocks in order to create soil to give something, so something could grow so they could have sheep, but most of them eventually became fishermen. And that's why to this day you see the very famous Aran knit sweaters, and you'll hear about those sweaters in the story too. because they had a very practical purpose. When you were washed off the ship and they found your body, from the design on the sweater, they knew what family you belonged to. My character is Angus O'Flaherty. He's an older teen, the son of the O'Flaherty family. I chose the O'Flaherty name because it's the name of a very famous poet that came from the Aran Islands. And because of what I was going to have my characters do later on in the story, writing would become a very important aspect of what their talents would be. Aaron O'Flaherty and his family were sailing down the Atlantic doing their fishing, and a storm hit, threw them off course, and eventually they were blown upwards to County Mayo, where James was playing on the Cromwells Fortress, and he saves the ship, the family, from disaster because he knew where the submerged rocks were and he could guide them into the harbor. They would have lived in this is a famine era cottage. This is a typical dwelling of the people of Ireland during the famine era, and you can understand why they would, when they heard stories of America with its streets paved with gold, they would want to sell everything they had, pay the $12, and get on a ship and come to America. Now, while all this was going on, James saving the O'Flaherty family, my third character was taking a walk by Donegal Castle. This is Donegal Castle. It is on the west coast of County Clare. It overlooks the village of Doolin, and that's how Doolin looks today. And when we went there, you can't go in the castle because it is a real castle and it is privately owned, and it's owned by Americans. And they don't allow you to go inside the castle, but they do allow you to come onto the property to take a nice picture. Here we have the OGrady family, and Megan OGrady is the daughter of the family. It is that castle which was once in history part of their family in my story. And they could no longer live there because they could no longer pay the taxes because when the penal laws were enforced, they lost everything. So they had to live in a little cottage away from their castle. This became a tense time for them. All these little walls that you see here being built, these are called famine walls. This is the way the Irish people in Western Ireland got a piece of bread and a bowl of soup. They would help build these walls around all the pastures, and it gave them a sense of worth. It gave them a sense of doing something and not getting a handout for doing nothing. And so when you go to Ireland and you see this beautiful pastures with all these beautiful brick walls and so neatly stacked, every one of those was built by starving Irishmen during the famine. Megan is a fiery lass in my story, kind of a, if you know Maureen O'Hara type of person with the long red hair, and since Maureen O'Hara is kind of like a favorite of mine, I kind of patterned her as a young Maureen O'Hara in the story, with the long red hair and the bright eyes and the fiery personalities, and take no gruff from any of the guys and that kind of thing. But her parents wanted something more for her. Her parents wanted her to get out of there, to be able to go to school. Now, public schools were jointly done by the Catholics, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Church of England in Ireland after the Act of Emancipation. But they weren't widespread to the western side of Ireland during the time of my story. So Megan wouldn't have had much of an opportunity for a good education. So when Aunt Maggie, the sister of her mother, shows up and offers to take her to America with her new husband, they jumped at the chance to get her here to America to be educated. The aunt and uncle, Aunt Maggie, is based on a historical character from our own family who really came over to America during the famine era. Uncle Colin is based on a character who is attached to Armstrong Caldwell, who happens to be the founder of the Balik China industry. And we weave that story into my novel because Colin is the one who would represent the Balik company in America to try to sell their china to the American merchants. The final and fourth main character in the book is Father Thomas OMalley, OSA. This is St. Nicholas Collegiate Church. Today, of course, it is part of the Church of Ireland. It is here that legend has Columbus praying when he was going about to all the countries of Europe, trying to get someone to sponsor him to prove that the world was round and sail to the east by going west. In the main square of Galway is Lynch Castle. Lynch Castle was the country home of a very wealthy Catholic Irish family until the penal laws came in, and this building was then used as a prison. In my story, Thomas OMalley is newly ordained and comes back from Rome to minister to the people. He's immediately captured, is thrown into Lynch prison, and so his history is one of persecution in that first year. They had to release him the next year. The emancipation freed everyone. And he was assigned to the Aran Islands so that he could keep a watch on him because his name was OMalley. And they still hadn't gotten over Gracie OMalley. So that is why I have him placed in the Aran Islands. In the Aran Islands, he befriends the O'Flaherty family, and he is on that ship that James saves when they come across Inishbofin. Now, I chose the Augustinian order in particular for Thomas OMalley because of an interview I did at St. Augustine Church right here in Philadelphia. Father Michael Slattery was the then pastor of the church. And it turns out that he's connected with the Chicago Theological Union, where I took courses, and he was there when I was there. He was recommended to me by Father Richard Fragamenti, who is the pastor of Our Lady of Pompeii, which is an immigrant church with a long history in Chicago, which is our family's home parish when we immigrated to America. So you see how everything comes together when you're doing research. It's just amazing how you meet these people. And Father Fragamenti was at CTU as well, still is. And I wrote a story about the history, a fictional story of the history of Our Lady of Pompeii called Stolen Christmas as a result of my interview with him. And then he helps me get to interview Father Michael. Father Marty Smith of the Augustinian Order right here at Villanova helped me get some historical information from the Heritage Room of the Augustinian priests right here on campus. He's been a great help to me in putting together little stories, and you're going to see one of those stories pretty soon. But the Irish people left Ireland by the thousands. And they left from some left from Galway Harbor, some left from Cobb, which is outside of Cork. Most left from there. But in Galway Harbor in 1849, when my story takes place, right near the Spanish Arch, that's a 16th century building. It was called the Spanish Arch because the Spanish ships would sneak in the harbor, drop off supplies, and drop off priests to help the Irish people during the time when it wasn't allowed. Anyway, the Cushla McCree is harbored there, and that is a real ship that sailed in 1849 from Galway to New York City, and that brings my characters. Father OMalley is given Angus and James to be guardian of. Megan is on the ship with her aunt and uncle, and they are coming to America to a new life. Here at the Spanish Arch, you're going to get a little flashback story of how the desperation of some of the people in Ireland during the famine brought some of them to crime, some of them to robbery, and some of them to be a very helpful and kind people. By the thousands, with my characters among them, the ship would cross America to America. It takes 27 days. The people are crammed into this ship. They have tainted water. They have very little food. It is said they're given less than a pound of food a day, which was at that time barely enough to keep a person alive. Most of them, many of them died. And even when they got to harbor in Montreal, New York, Philadelphia, many people died on ship before they even got off the ship. In Montreal, it was so bad that at one time 500 bodies were thrown into the St. Lawrence River, and they just floated down the river because there was nothing they could do with how many died on the ship. our people come nonetheless. And 27 days, Father OMalley decides he's going to change the way things are going to be run on this ship. And he institutes a few things, because what the sailors did was add rum to the water to make it drinkable. But only thing, the rum water made everyone drunk. And they were doing things that Father OMalley didn't think were appropriate. I don't think any of us sitting here would think would be appropriate. And they were a bad example, let us say, for the young people on the ship. And so he decides to make a few changes in the sanitary conditions and how they did things and collected water from the rain and so forth. They land here in America, and when they land here, the first thing they face in Battery Park, which is at the southern tip of Manhattan, is Castle Garden. Castle Garden, called Clinton Castle today, is where the immigrants had to file through. There was no Ellis Island, there was no Statue of Liberty. This is before all of that happened. This is the fortress they faced. Not unlike the fortress ruin of the Cromwell Fortress on Innisfawen in the mind of young James. But Father OMalley leads his flock off the Cushla Cree and reads this poem from a very famous author, poetess at the time, Miss Jane Francesca Elgie. Weary men, what reap ye? Golden corn for the stranger, what sow ye? Human corpses that wait for the avenger, fainting forms, hunger-stricken, what see you in the offing? Stately ships to bear our food away amid the stranger's scoffing. There's a proud array of soldiers, what do they round your door? They guard our master's granaries from the thin hands of the poor. Pale mothers, wherefore weeping? Would to God that we were dead, our children swoon before us, and we cannot give them bread. Now, the good priest was trying to see, you're not going to have to endure this anymore. That's what he meant by reading the poem, but what happened, what do you think would happen? The people got all scared and said, oh my God, we're going into this prison-like thing, and we're going to end up like this poem. So, but they don't. They get through Castle Garden, they get their little piece of paper, and on the piece of paper there's a box, and if they write free in there, that means you're allowed to go anywhere you want to go in America. In this case, it was New York, because every state regulated the immigrant population that would come into their state. There was no unified code and immigrant office at the time in the United States. And so our characters make their way in New York to a street called Broadway. Now we're all familiar with this street. Only at this time of history, this is a new street. It is the Broad Street. It would be the competitor to the Bowery, where all the theaters, all the businesses, and all the retail shops were located in Manhattan at this period of history. It would eventually become this, but not for another 100 years. But on that street, they would strive to go. And they were going to St. Patrick Cathedral. And they had to go up Wall Street in order to get to Broadway, in order to get to Prince Street, in order to turn and go to Old St. Patrick Cathedral. Because St. Patrick Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, that's the new one. And it's there because of the Bishop of New York, and you'll hear about that too. His vision was to see an expanding America and an expanding population from Europe, and he wanted a church to accommodate all of them, and it was because of his vision that that cathedral stands on Fifth Avenue today. On that journey, our characters are going to meet some New York high society girls because of a few antics of our heroes, our young heroes. And I want to, and the reason I put this kind of thing in the story is, again, I wanted some happiness, I wanted some joy, and I wanted some reality that these are still young people on an adventure. It may be hard, it may be harsh, and from where they're coming from might have been unthinkable in our terms today, but they're still young people and they still want to have a good time. So in this scene, we have them showing off for these girls who are watching them, because these girls are high society girls. They're with the parasols and the lace dresses and the silk scarves and so forth and so on. They're looking down their noses at these young guys coming down the street with this priest. And so the guys were going to give them a little show, and so they climb up on the horse. Well, Angus never rode a horse. He's a fisherman. There are no horses on the Aran Islands at this time. Maybe a donkey or two, but no horses. "Phew, Betsy gal, you need a washing," Angus called out without losing his balance. The lad, who only knew the sea and a tiny island chain called the Aran Islands, was going to master this horse-riding thing if it meant the death of him. For Father OMalley and many who watched, that was exactly what they thought was about to happen. For he began to shift his upside-down body, held up by his hands on a saddle, which was on an ever more agitated horse. James patted the white diamond on Betsy's forehead to keep her calm, for she was no circus horse, but a professional police horse. This James was sure she would say had she a voice to speak. There was a slight shift in Betsy's weight on her legs, but Angus remained steady. Inch by inch she had moved his hands over to the slipping saddle seat, and now the silent crowd watched with anticipation of his slipping off the horse. And those society girls are going to be introduced to you as secondary characters in my tale, and they are Elizabeth Montague, Olivia Seymour, and Victoria Wanamaker. And you might know the name Wanamaker in this part of the world. And in my story, she is the niece of John Wanamaker, the famous retailer of Philadelphia. And that's how we get connected and start the connection with Philadelphia in the tale. As they continue their journey up towards, they're going to pass Grace Church. This was the high society church of New York City at the time. It was a Protestant church, of course, a church, an Anglican church, and this is where the elite would go. In my story, you're going to see a little tension between the Catholics and non-Catholics as they come to this church, and for the first time, these immigrants from Ireland step foot into a church that is not Catholic. And yet the church stands and no lightning hits. The Protestant girls are shaking in their boots, thinking the same thing that the Catholic guys are thinking, that they're going to be struck by lightning because a Catholic walked in their church. Nothing happens. And so begins the breaking down of the barriers between the faiths and the people, the new people and the old people of New York. This is Union Square. Now, during the time of my story, Union Square was nothing but a patch of green along the new street of Broadway. And here's where the politicians would gather and the orators and you know what they say, they brought their little box to stand on the box and give their speeches and so forth. And in my story, you are introduced to a very real thing that was happening in New York during this time as the immigrants came in 1849. Here, political gatherings were taking place, and it was a secret organization that was just being formed called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. They were a division of the American Nativist Party, which history books label as the know-nothings, because if they were ever asked questions, they were told they have to say, "I know nothing." But their goal was to prevent immigrants from coming to America and to stop the takeover of America by the Pope. Now here we are in a city preparing to welcome the Pope with such joy and such fanfare and such, I can't even describe it. Since the time John Paul II came to Chicago, I can't imagine when America was so excited to have a religious leader on its shores. And Francis, of course, has won the heart of the world and certainly the heart of the people here in the States. And so our characters are going up Broadway, and the people in Union Park are speaking out against the new immigrants at the very same time. Meanwhile, in actual historic time, Bishop John Hughes of New York City, who was called the Dagger because when he spoke, and if he was angry with you, it was like a knife piercing your heart. He was coming back from Baltimore, the first diocese of the United States, where he had just met with Father John Newman, who would later become the Bishop of Philadelphia. So again, we begin to establish another connection with Philadelphia for my characters to eventually get here. There, Father John Hughes was the bishop who single-handedly prevented an all-out war between the immigrant population of New York City and the New Yorkers who were against the immigrants. And I found out about this story from Monsignor John Ahern, who is the Monsignor of Old St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. And he brought me into, we were sitting in the rectory, the actual rectory where John Hughes lived, the actual rectory where my characters would have gone to if they were real characters at that time in history. And there inside the rectory, there is a curio cabinet. And in the curio cabinet are all kinds of historic artifacts from the 19th century when the immigrants came and so forth, and also a rock. And I said, well, why do you have a rock in your curio cabinet? Well, I love rocks anyway. Wherever I go, I collect these rocks, I date them and tell them where it's from. And I said, when I die, my grandkids have to put them on my grave. So everybody knows my affinity for rocks. So when I hear a rock story, this is cool, and this is going to go in my book. The Monsignor tells me how that rock saved New York City from being destroyed. And later on, we're going to find out how. One way that Bishop Hughes thought to save the Irish in New York and all the immigrant population, because the Germans were not being received too well either, was the institution of the Irish Regiment, the 69th Irish Regiment. This is their original banner that is housed in Old St. Patrick's Rectory. The Monsignor allowed me to use and photograph it and so forth. And this regiment was founded by Bishop Hughes to protect the immigrant population from those who would harm them. Eventually, they became assimilated into the actual military of the United States. They served in the Civil War. They're the only regiment in the Civil War that did not retreat at the Battle of Bull Run. And they eventually fought in every battle of the war through World War II. Where our characters are going is Mulberry Street. This is the Immigrant Quarter of New York City. Today it's New York's Little Italy. Then it was New York's Little Ireland. Right next door to it was Little Germany, and right next door to that was the Bowery. And on the Bowery is where all the clubs and all the theaters and all the retail shops and where the New Yorkers would go for a little bit of fun. Here, thousands of people were crammed into these kinds of tenement buildings with these kinds of what we call fire escapes now. And here's where you're going to meet a few of my other secondary characters. But here too became the scourge of the Irish population, because literally thousands of young people roamed the streets of New York as gangs, and they would terrorize their own population, not only the New Yorkers who had a little money, but even their own people. Bishop Hughes couldn't allow this to happen. There's no way the New York people were going to accept the immigrants if they're going to live like this and terrorize their own people. So he began a system of protectorate schools, and along with St. Elizabeth Ann Seton schools, it saved the Irish youth from themselves and from prison. And literally they became the store owners, the grocery store owners. And those were the girls who owned the grocery stores, and the women who ran the shops and things like that. And then the men became responsible in the fields. They were in construction fields and so forth, the railroad industry, which was growing at the time, and so forth. And here's where you're going to be introduced to Liam Clancy, Riley McCarthy, Connor Smith, who symbolized the tough youths of the day and how they would be turned around to better people by meeting people like Father OMalley, Angus, and James. Now, I had already established James and Angus in my story as budding writers. They would keep a journal every day of their trip over here to America, and every day since they got to America. Journal writing was a very common practice in the 19th century. In fact, Elizabeth II of England keeps a journal. Can you imagine that journal, 63 years on the throne? Every day she writes in this journal. So it's a very common practice, particularly in the 19th century. And it's going to be very important in my story because it's going to give you insight into the personalities and the characters and the heart of the characters and what they see and say about America. And then I had to think about, okay, now we've got these other guys on Mulberry Street coming into the picture. They have to be redeemed in some way. This is a redemptive story. We have Megan there in the mix with all these guys, and now the New York City girls are following them and accompanying them on their journey to St. Patrick's. You know, how are we going to bring them together? What's going to be the gel that brings them together, that makes them a unit? Well, I had just seen a singing group called Celtic Thunder, and I don't know if you saw them on PBS and so forth, but they do concerts all around. And I saw them in concert in Chicago and in Milwaukee, and I thought, well, what a better profession for young Irish people than sing, right? But they had to sing, you know, their Irish songs that were appropriate for them. So I began to develop them into a band of singers so that they could have an appeal that goes beyond New York and goes to other places like Philadelphia, which is their goal. And so I chose a tune, a 17th century tune by Thomas Canelian for them to sing. One morning early I went out on the shore of Loch Lennon, the lazy trees of summertime, and the warm rays of the sun as I wandered through the townlands and the luscious grassy plains. No cap nor cloak I saw this maiden wear, her neck and feet were bare. The city girls blushed but smiled as well as they pulled up their skirts quite modestly to reveal their booted feet. So we have a little bit of fun with their travels to St. Patrick's Cathedral and a little introduction to some of the music that you're going to hear throughout my tale, Irish music. And their goal is here, St. Patrick's, Old St. Patrick's. This is Old St. Patrick burning. Now this was not done viciously. It was accidentally burned in 1866 when a ceramics factory nearby caught fire and the flames jumped over and it burned down the cathedral. They rebuilt it here. These walls, however, were built because of the riots in New York against the immigrants, and they were built to protect the people of the neighborhood and to protect the church from the rioters. And this is the interior of the Cathedral Basilica as it is today. Here is where my characters go. This is the actual rectory where Monsignor Ahern interviewed me. And here is where you hear the story of what Bishop Hughes did to save New York City. As I said, the Order, the Star-Spangled Banner, and the Know Nothing Nativist Party, they were against the immigrants and they were preaching. About 5 years prior to where my story takes place, it got really bad. And they plotted to burn down the cathedral and the Catholic schools of New York City. The bishop finds this out and he goes to Mayor Harper and he protests. And all the mayor said is, well, what do you want me to do? What can I do? You can send forth your new police force, of which you are so proud, and protect the people on both sides, and save yours and my city this day. For I tell you, as I hold on to the cross of Christ about my neck, that should one Irishman be harmed, one church burned, that this city shall be likened to a second Moscow and left in ashes. And of course, Bishop Hughes was referring to what the Muscovites did when Napoleon was approaching the gates of Moscow by burning their city rather than have Napoleon conquer them. It motivated the mayor to take action. In the meantime, just as a follow-up, just in case he couldn't get this mayor to do something, the bishop had met with the ancient order of Hibernians, and he brought that rock, that very rock that I saw in that curio cabinet, with him. And he gave instructions to all the members of the order to dig a cobblestone out of the streets of New York around Mulberry Street and Prince Street, where the cathedral was, and then climb to the roofs of all the buildings. And if they saw torches being tossed to the cathedral, they were given permission to throw the rocks at the rioters. Luckily for us and for history in New York City, the mayor did listen to Bishop Hughes. He did send the police. They did talk some sense in these rioters. The rioters heard about the rocks on the roofs, and they turned away, and the city was saved. And that enabled our people to eventually board a train and go to their ultimate destination, Philadelphia. All along the 27 days of the voyage, James, Angus, Megan, and some of their buddies on the ship had been taught about the Declaration of Independence, had been taught a little bit about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was their dream. They were going to Philadelphia. They were going to be true Americans. They were going to go and see where Washington walked, where Jefferson wrote the Declaration, and so forth and so on. This became a burning desire in their souls. And so they come to what is today Washington Square. In Washington Square, however, what is going on is a political rally. It is October 9, 1849. It will symbolize the political turmoil of our political process of the time, the state of the anti-immigrant movement, and the lawlessness spreading across Philadelphia. For they have arrived on an actual election night that took place here in Philadelphia. And rallies were being held throughout the city. Now, that was common to have election night rallies. But one rally in particular was not so common, for it was soon to be taken over by a very ruthless leader of a gang known as the Philadelphia Killers. And their leader was Charles Anderson Chester, who was waiting for the right moment when the candidate in this square, prior to the statue, was making his political speech to be elected to the United States House of Representatives. His name was Levin of the American Nativist Party, and he did get elected, an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic candidate. And so let me just give you a little feel for what was going on then. Charles Anderson Chester stood near the statue of George Washington, surrounded by a throng of agitated people. Speaking to the crowd was one Louis Levin, a candidate for the United States House of Representatives. It was election day in Philadelphia. The candidate was calling for new laws to stop the flood of immigrants. Sound familiar to some of the rhetoric today? He claimed that papist immigrants were plotting to destroy a free America and bring it under the rule of the Pope in Rome. He waited for his moment to take action. And that action was going to be taking place not far from Independence Hall itself. The Pennsylvania courthouse was not called Independence Hall at the time, but it was still very famous, for this is where the chamber was, where the Declaration of Independence was signed, and this is where was housed a very famous bell, cracked and not working anymore, but a symbol in the minds of James and Angus of what America means, the place of liberty. And that would be what drew them and draws them to Independence Hall. In the story, they are walking very nearby, making their way to St. Augustine Church. And they are horrifically introduced to the Philadelphia killer gang. James and Angus are torn away from Father OMalley, who is detained and roughed up by the gang people. They're forced to run with the gang that night. The goal of that gang that night was to burn down California House, which was being built to house immigrant families. They would eventually become a witness to an abduction. The abduction is a real one that took place on this day of one person named Ophelia Thompson. She was a would-be actress. They would be the witness to the murder of Charles Anderson Chester, the leader of the Philadelphia Killers, so that we could bring all of these stories together and give them a sense of why they had to turn things around in America, why they wanted to, James still wanting to be the priest, and Angus wanted to do something to make him a true American. They get captured at the Walnut Street Theater. Even in this time of history, the Walnut Street Theater is probably one of the most famous and long-running, continuously running legitimate theaters in America. And they're excited about coming near this theater because on the billboard they're advertising a play starring Edwin Forrest. Edwin Forrest was the most renowned American actor in 19th century America, famous all over for his Shakespearean work. They had met this actor when they were taking a pit stop at Holmesburg Junction on the train coming into the city. Because in Holmesburg Junction, Edwin Forrest actually has an estate, and that estate was built to train actors, American actors, for the stage. They knocked over the actor on that train platform in my story as they were running to the privy to give a little bit of humor to their meeting, but nevertheless, the actor is real. And what he was doing for the acting population in America is an actual historical event. So here in the Walnut Street Theater, James and Angus are all excited that their friend now, Edwin Forrest, was going to give them a chance to sing in Philadelphia. Let me give you a little side note here. Edwin Forrest was personal friends with the father of Edwin Booth and John Wilkes Booth. Edwin is named after Edwin Forrest, the actor. Years later, of course, John would gain some infamy of his own. The rioters of October 9th took over the streets, and what they did was wheel down a cart with a barrel of tar on it, and they lit it, and then they were wheeling it down past the Walnut Street Theater going towards the California House at the time, not very far from St. Augustine Church, is what my understanding is, and threatening, of course, and eventually did burn it down to the ground. During that, however, we also had the murder of the leader of the gang, which is kind of like almost a good thing for my story, in that my characters were able to escape. Villanova University, then Villanova College, looked like this in 1849. And it is here, ultimately, that my characters, James and Angus, would go to school because St. Augustine Academy was destroyed, the library was destroyed, and much of it was damaged during the riots against the Catholics during 1844. And so here's Villanova's going to have a prominent role where the characters will be educated and where they're going to begin their singing career and their training for the priesthood, for James anyway. This is an open-air market on 2nd Street near South Street here in Old City. And it's here in a place like this that the riots of 1844 began. Then the Kensington district was a very heavily Irish district at the time. In the open-air market, American nativist candidate was giving a speech against the immigrants. Why they chose that location when they're totally surrounded by the immigrant population on all sides of the market, one can only imagine. But it did result in a fight, and the fight resulted in a riot, and the riot resulted in massive damage, death, and destruction to the city. our characters go by this open-air market, which represents the open-air market of the riots of 1844, to get to this church. But they didn't get to this church because this is the original St. Augustine Church, the one that was burned down during the riots of 1844. They would be arriving at the new church. In 1844, a group of the riots from that open-air market moved on to this church. On the way, they burned down the Hibernian fire department, so therefore there was no fire engines, there were no fire people to battle the fires they were setting. 50 homes were set ablaze, convents were set, schools were set ablaze, St. Michael's Church was burned to the ground, all in May of 1844, and just a couple of days before they would ultimately reach St. Augustine. At the corner of 4th and Vine Streets to this very day is St. Augustine Church. At that corner, the mayor of Philadelphia had come to plead for reason, had come to plead for peace. But the pleas of Mayor John Marin Scott fell on deaf ears. General Cadwalader, who quelled the previous day's riots when St. Michael's was burned down and the convents were burned down, had not yet arrived. Troops were the only means to suppress the riots in the city, because a city police force didn't exist. Everything was divided up into suburbs. All what we consider the city of Philadelphia today were called suburbs of the old city. And each old city had a police, and then each of those little suburbs had their own police force, and none of them worked together. The only one that could possibly help was the sheriff. He would form a posse, and he would bring in the posse, but they were hopelessly outnumbered, and nobody would listen to them. And so during the riots of 1844, it didn't get them anywhere. This is St. Augustine Church today. Some of this is what our characters would have seen when they came to Vine and 4th Street. Here they would see on the wall, "The Lord seeth." Their eyes would be drawn to it. They would wonder, what does that mean? Why is that so important? Later on, they would find out that that is the only wall that was left of the original church when it was burned to the ground in the riots of 1844. And you'll hear a little bit more detail of that as the story goes on. The pastor at the time, when they arrived at the church, was Father John O'Dwyer, Order of St. Augustine, who had also been at the church when it was originally burned. So too were a Father Harnett, a young associate, and Father Moriarty, who would become a pastor at the church as well, newly returned from Rome from his PhD studies. He greets Father OMalley and his charges. The lads looked at those gold-letter words and read them aloud. "The Lord seeth." The pastor turned toward them. "I'll have Father Harnett explain the significance of those words tomorrow. As for tonight, we had best get you into dry clothes and cleaned up. Wouldn't you agree, Father OMalley?" The guilt-ridden priest turned and saw the true condition of his charges in the gaslight glow in the sacristy. Angus's shirt was ripped to shreds. He was covered in mud and soot, so that his flaming red hair appeared almost as dark as that of James. The young lad from Innisfawen was soaking wet and caked with mud all over. Smudges of dark, now crusted ash virtually covered his entire face, so that only those turquoise eyes gave any color to his countenance. He noticed immediately the lifelessness in those usually vibrant eyes were now void of their sparkle. But that sparkle would eventually return as they get assimilated and protected by the people of St. Augustine Parish and learn about the story of the sister bell. This is the sister bell of the Liberty Bell. It is located right here on the campus of Villanova University in the Heritage Room of the Augustinian priests. It is much smaller than it was when it was originally cast, and that's part of the story. The Liberty Bell and another bell were ordered at the same exact time from England to be placed in the clock tower of what we call Independence Hall today. The Liberty Bell got here first, so it was put in the clock tower. So the government, colonial government at the time, gave the twin bell, which came a couple of days later, to St. Augustine Church on permanent loan. And that is the bell that was hanging in the tower when the rioters came. And that is why it's called the sister bell. And I want to read a little bit of the story of what happens to the Liberty Bell, the twin of the Liberty Bell. Legend says that the church, when the rioters got to 4th and Vine Street, some teens squeezed through the lines of troops put there by General Cadwalader, so that for the safety of the mayor, who was speaking to them and pleading for them not to go home, not to do this. Those teens sneaked in, broke a window, climbed into the church, and wreaked havoc on the church. Lordy, would you look at all of this? It's like a palace for the Pope himself, it is. Henry's eyes were fixed on original pieces of art sent by the Augustinians from their mother house in Rome. They were priceless pieces intended to adorn their new church at the time. We need more light. The ruffians would then go on and they would get more light by lighting the altar cloth over the altar, lighting the candles and throwing them about the church. Eventually they would trip over a pipe. It was a gas pipe. And they would kick on it until it burst. And suddenly they heard the hissing and they ran away through the priest's chair, through the window, and climbed out of the church, because seconds later there was a huge explosion which engulfed the interior of St. Augustine. Instantly there was an explosion as the gas ignited and flames shot up the sides of the interior walls. The force of the blast of fire could be felt by the teens as they crawled toward another window. Outside, the mob heard the burst of the fire explosion and the flames engulfing the interior. They cheered as the mayor, shocked to his core, was forced to leave. The church was totally destroyed except for that wall. When the tower began to shake, the sister bell began to ring, and it was almost, they thought, was like the tolling of mourning when somebody died, as the tower rocked back and forth, and the people, lots of people, not only the rioters but now spectators from the city itself, came to watch the fire, and it rocked back and forth, and the toll of the bell clanged, and finally the tower collapsed and the bell fell within the interior of the church and was literally melted down from the inferno inside. When it was all cooled off, they found shards of the original bell, and that's what they cast into that bell, which eventually became the bell to call the students of Villanova College to class, and also called the people being trained for the Augustinian orders to prayer and to dinner and lunch and whatever. And remember, in those days, they actually prayed the Liturgy of the Hours together. And so they're the morning prayer and the noon prayer and the afternoon prayer and Vespers at night. So my characters had to go through all that because they were part of the system. Ultimately, they would finally reach their goal. Their singing group became known as the Celtic Warriors. They became the Rage of Philadelphia. Now that is all based on a historical incident. At this time in history, a songwriter by the name of Stephen Foster was gaining a little bit of fame. And his kind of folksy songs, and Americanish songs, attracted these new immigrants, so they began to incorporate that into their Irish singing stuff. Okay. And then they brought those songs on tour throughout the city and so forth, and they sang at the Music Fund Hall, and they sang at the Walnut Street Theater and so forth. And now their sponsor, Edwin Forrest, was going to take them to see the Liberty Bell. Well, boys, this is the bell. You've heard about it. It rings no more, but it still rings in one's heart each time they see it. So you are right to stroke it gently and pay it reverence, for it has seen much and will have much more to see through you. Forrest was quite proud of himself, that without a script he was able to dramatize the vision he was sure these lads were feeling in their rapidly beating hearts. And now, turn here and enter the signing room. Now, all of what you have seen comes together back at St. Augustine Church. This is how Father O'Dwyer, this is the view Father O'Dwyer would have had when Father OMalley entered with the mud-soaked James and Angus just escaping from the Philadelphia killers. The style of the church is typical. The frescoes and murals were not there. The statues were not there. They had not been totally decorated yet. That would come sometime later. For the purpose of my story, seated in this first row here would be the apprentice to some of the artists who would paint those frescoes up on the ceiling of St. Augustine, and also paint the dome of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. as well, because that's that artist's claim to fame. So I had to tweak history a little here because it didn't just fit, because those frescoes were painted a couple of decades after my story takes place. So I put an apprentice in there to make a connection with what eventually would be put in that church. All of you have seen has been a glimpse at what has been woven into a tale of freedom, a tale of hope, a tale of faith, and a tale of love. It leads you back to St. Augustine Church. Seen here, Father O'Dwyer would have been standing when he greeted Father OMalley and the lads on the nights of the election riots and murders. The frescoes and murals would be added later, and the character of Arturo Colonna would be introduced to be that apprentice that connects my story to actual history of the frescoes. Here would be the celebration of the 19th century sensation called the Celtic Warriors, for within these walls, symphonic and choral concerts actually were held for many years before the original church was destroyed. From the Walnut Street Theater, the Celtic Warriors would return to Independence Hall once more. For now, they wanted to induct all that had become part of their band into their own band of brothers. Here, the last Megan would have other ideas for James, who announced his vocation to the priesthood, and thus opening the door for Angus to step in. Here in the rectory, lying upon James's bed, was one who would bring a new understanding to what it means not to be free. And so let me end by reading you a lyric from the song they sang at the Walnut Street Theater. It's a tale of how James and Angus and the other guys met. From atop the wall I did spy a boat being tossed about the sea. Says I to the lads, come follow me. With waving arms I rang along the wall, for the rocks below gave no call to stall. Aye, 'twas a lucky day those lads met me, for out of pure love the future came to be. For the waves crashed up as the tides did rise, to save that boat, much to my surprise. Now those days did pass, and we went to mass, with solemn heads we bowed. Then among the runes on the grass did we receive the Lord. Aye, 'twas a lucky day that lad met me, for out of pure love the future came to be, and the waves which rose would make us close they have brought us across the sea. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, they have a lovely spread back there. Do take, yes.
You made one of your characters named Flaherty, right?
Yes, Flaherty, yes.
Well, Father Flaherty was one of our presidents here, and he came from a very distinguished family. His brother was a Maryknoll missionary in Guatemala. His sister was once the president. She's a St. Joe nun of Chestnut Hill College. And the other member of the family was for a long time, his name was James Flaherty, the head of the Knights of Columbus, the Grand Knight of the Knights of Columbus, for something like 15 years. And there are now some people who say he should be canonized, James Flaherty. The only unmarried, the only one of that group who did not become religious became the mother of a young woman whose husband taught here for many years.
Oh, wow.
But the Flahertys were quite important.
So then the legacy of the Flahertys did come over across the pond.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Anything else? Any others? Well, yes.
Excuse me, what year was the original St. Augustine Church built?
Oh, built? I don't, oh
The
my.
one that was destroyed?
The one that was destroyed in 1844 was built in the colonial period, so it was old. I don't know the exact date.
1790s.
Yeah, it was
Pretty sure.
it was pretty old. It might have been right after independence.
1796.
So it would have to be shortly after that. I don't remember the building date.
When I first saw the photo of the interior of St. Augustine, I thought it was Old St. Joe's. And then I saw the two doors leading into the church, which Old St. Joe's has nothing like that.
Mhm.
St. Joe's is very hard to find because it was built to be hidden. It was built in 1733.
Well, St. Mary's Cathedral here too was built in a way to be unobtrusive and not to people take notice of it, to just look at it as a regular building for the riots that were going on and so forth against the Catholics. So that would be typical.
Which is book one, Journey of Three Pure
Journey of
Hearts,
Three Pure Hearts is the prequel to this story,
which
it
is
will-
Pure and Tarnished Hearts.
which is Pure and Tarnished Hearts.
Okay, so
So in the Journey book, you will meet the characters in the homeland, Ireland, find out what's going on in Ireland. You will sail with them across on the Cushla McCree, and it's their adventures on the ship. And then Pure and Tarnished Hearts is their story in America.
okay. You said before the Emancipation Law of 1829, the Irish, or the Catholic Irish, could not live within 5 miles of the city.
Right.
So who actually lived in the cities? Who lived in the city if they weren't allowed to live in the city?
The followers of the landlords, who were absentee landlords who lived in Dublin or London. Some of the Irish did take to the new catechism, what they call the new catechism, which means the Church of England, the Church of Ireland, they call it today. And those are the people who were allowed to live in the cities. It was a sad time. It was a very sad time.
I saw another connection. You said Father Hughes met who would become Bishop Newman. who was
St. John
Father
Newman.
John Newman.
Mm-hmm.
And Father Hughes had this idea to have what essentially were Catholic schools in New York City.
That's correct.
Well, in Philadelphia, that's what St. John Newman did.
That's right.
He's the father of the Catholic school system.
That is right.
in the city. So I'm wondering if they had a chat with each other.
Quite possibly, because they both started the work shortly thereafter. Their meeting is historically true. What they talked about, it's not recorded, so you can't really say. But they did meet, and it was very common to go to Baltimore because that's the first diocese. It is very common for the priests coming to America to report to the local bishop, which is what Father OMalley did when they got to New York, even though his ultimate goal was Philadelphia. Those are all common courtesy things. So, yeah, I don't know if they had that conversation, or maybe they just shared the same type of vision, because John Newman was facing the same type of problems Bishop Hughes was, and he was just the head of his order at the time. He wasn't bishop yet. So when he became bishop, the reason your cathedral basilica is built the way it is because of the riots that burned down St. Augustine. They built it with these big blocks, and they made the windows high so people couldn't throw stuff at the church and destroy the stained glass windows, and to protect the building from severe damage. So that's why your cathedral looks the way it looks.
Which is not beautiful.
Outside, but inside it's spectacular. I'm overwhelmed when I walk in there. Yes.
You mentioned Elizabeth Ann Seton, who had a dreadful time with her family when she became a young
Because she was
About
Episcopal.
that time?
Elizabeth would come before this, a little before this time, but it would be, she'd be a contemporary of what's going on. Her sisters would be a contemporary of what's going on. Remember, she did a lot of her work also in Maryland and that, places like that. Anything else? Well, the bookstore has my books available if you wish to pick up a copy. I'd be happy to sign it for you if you do. And do enjoy the treats, because they have some lovely treats back there. Thank you very much.